Welcome to the WanderLearn show. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Jonny Hanson, who has written a fantastic book about living with lynx. And he also talks about living with bears and rewilding the place with wolves. And at first I thought, this is going to be another very biased book that just talks about why it's important to rewild the place and why we should bring all these species back and not consider the other side of the story of why it's not maybe a great idea or why some people are not going to be that in favor of it. But I was so wrong. It's a fantastic book. That's a great documentary because it's so balanced. It captures all the different sides of the story. Fascinating discussion that we have about them. So you should definitely check out the book and enjoy this podcast with Dr. Hanson. And also become a patron at patreon.com/ftapon to pick up some cool rewards. A myth that you would like to correct that is widespread that people have about lynx or wolves or wild bears?
Bears, we can set to one time. The chances of bears, because of their size and the potential risk to human life, again, it's much more of a perceived risk than natural risk. Bears are extremely unlikely to ever be reintroduced to Britain or Ireland. But discussions with lynx are quite advanced. There are two projects that are actively scoping and considering the topic at this time. There was an illegal release of lynx in the Scottish Highlands at the start of 2025, which has really, in a mostly negative way, rocketed this up the political agenda and started to politicize the issue. With wolves, the idea is less advanced because wolves are more complex to coexist with than lynx are. They can take cattle and horses as opposed to lynx, which can just take sheep. But I think it could happen at some point in the future, maybe later in the 21st century. The myth with both of these that is worth understanding, again, and there's nuance with it, Francis, is that the risks to people are almost non-existent, including from wolves. Some scientists set out to calculate the risk of getting a person being killed by a wolf, and they just couldn't calculate the probability. It was incalculable. There was no supercomputer powerful enough to figure it out. That was in the days before AI. Maybe AI could answer that question for us now. And again, then when it comes to the risks to livestock, they're really quite small, statistically speaking. And if you looked at the last 10,000 years of us as a species keeping livestock, and you factored in livestock losses, you would probably find that climate or bad weather is number one, disease, number two, accidents like livestock falling into rivers or wandering off cliffs, number three. Probably people stealing other people's livestock, I would say that's number four. And you might find that predator losses are number five. So statistically speaking, the risk to livestock from lynx or from wolves is very small. But because of our evolutionary past in which these species represented a threat at times, and also our cultural stories like the Big Bad Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood, that low level of actual risk to livestock and to people is refracted through that lens and becomes a much higher level of perceived risk. And so we perceive that these animals are a bigger threat than they are. And with predators, as with politics, perception is often reality. So we need to absolutely point out the facts, but we also need to meet people where they're at in terms of the perceptions. And when it comes to livestock, and I learned this when I was researching and also making a film about snow leopards in Nepal with my colleagues there, sometimes, although the statistics say the chances of losing livestock to a snow leopard or to a lynx or wolf is very small, the actual incidents can become concentrated quite heavily in individual farms, individual farmers, individual communities. Maybe there's a problem animal that develops a habit of killing sheep. And then that becomes highly emotive. It can become very damaging also economically, but also psychologically for that farmer or community. And those are the ones that capture headlines, that go viral on social media, and that harden hearts. So there are myths here that need to be corrected, but we also need to come to them with nuance and with the full breadth of human knowledge to understand what's really going on.
And that nuance and human knowledge you definitely add in your book. I have a question, though. In your extensive research, which is quite remarkable, what did you learn that surprised you, Dr. Hanson?
I was surprised at the level of polarization over wolves in Europe. I was expecting that in the USA, and I probably found less polarization in wolves. I found lots of pragmatic people in all parts of the political spectrum and all walks of life who were good people who could.
What do you mean by polarization? In other words, that you expected Europeans to be largely pro bringing back wolves?
That I didn't expect there to be the degree of conflict over the return of wolves that I associated with the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and then Colorado. So I went to both of those places in the US to understand that. And I expected a degree of polarization and a lot of heat and anger and emotion in the USA. And I found it to an extent less than I expected. I wasn't expecting that degree of politicization, polarization, anger, bitterness, conflict in Europe than I found. And I went to the Netherlands and Switzerland, countries that I associate as being very effective and efficient, very collaborative with, especially the Swiss, a federal structure that is about dialogue and consensus. And I was quite taken aback, and I was deeply saddened by the degree of conflict over wolves. And again, less to do with wolves. The wolves becomes embroiled in the culture wars. Often it becomes a symbol, and you could choose any other issue from the culture wars. The wolf is but one, and there's a lot of hate and a lot of anger, and it made me sad, and I was quite taken back. And my hope for Britain and Ireland, as we consider the reintroduction of lynx, definitely, wolves maybe, bears probably not, is that we can do it in a way that avoids that, as much as possible, avoids that degree of politicization and polarization.
Well, that brings up my next question, which is among the three megafauna that you looked at, these apex predators, the lynx, the wolves, the bears, which one do you think is the hardest one to coexist with, to reintroduce of those three?
It's probably a toss-up with bears and wolves. Bears, although they're brown bears, the European brown bear not quite as big as the North American grizzly, but still they're big units and they have that potential. There was a famous, infamous case at the end of 2022 with an Italian jogger in northern Italy who surprised a mother bear with cubs and was killed. And again, that rocketed up the political agenda in Europe. But bears are largely omnivorous rather than carnivorous. They can be problematic with sheep, but wolves are really hard to coexist with when they return, when you've lost the memory of farming with them, lost the memory of living alongside them, something that is called the extinction of experience. So in the case of Britain and Ireland and large parts of Western Europe and some parts of the US as well, it wasn't just that the species became extinct locally, it's that our experience became extinct of what farming with them looked like, of changing farming practices, of accepting that maybe certain places keep your dog on a lead, or maybe keep an eye on your kids, that sort of thing. And wolves are by nature so adaptable as a species, so highly intelligent, so cooperative. They are so good at what they do that they're able to then thrive in landscapes that, again, we don't perceive as wild. And therefore that they bring them into landscapes. For example, visited a Dutch family in the Dutch countryside that you think of a domesticated agrarian landscape, then it was this place. It was canals and roads lined by oak trees and farms everywhere, and yet there were wolves back. And in the Netherlands especially, it's half the size of Ireland with 3 times the population. And it has about 100 wolves now, and I think 10 or 11 packs. There were 40 to 50 cubs born in the last season. It's an extraordinary comeback story, but we don't often associate wolves in places like that. And it's when we associate them with the Yellowstones and maybe the Rockies and maybe Alaska and maybe Scandinavia, those wilder places. And when wolves come back to places like that, it can be hard for farming communities, you have to change how they farm, because those changes that are required often make farming, which has very tight margins, and the issue of labor is always central in agriculture, always has been, always will be, that it makes farming more labor intensive. You have to guard your animals, you have to fence more, you have to have more staff in the field keeping an eye on livestock, you have to have dogs or llamas or donkeys, things like that. And that can put strain on farming businesses. It can put real strain. And then there's this also perception that wolves are a threat to ways of life. And this is where the symbolism, the kind of anthropology of coexistence comes in. And I saw a lot of that in places I went, that it wasn't so much about the wolf. People would say to me, even people opposed to their return, we said we don't hate wolves. We don't want, we resist these changes to our way of life. And that's a story you hear across the world. So for that reason, wolves, as much as I love them and admire them, they're tricky. They're tricky to coexist with. And in places even where lynx were reintroduced, like Switzerland, no one's talking about lynx rustling a few sheep every year. The wolves have hijacked the conversation. And I think it's fair to say wolves hijacked my book, in that I set out to talk primarily about lynx. And wherever I went, I would say I want to talk about lynx. People say, I don't want to talk about lynx. We don't have any problems with lynx. We want to talk about wolves.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I remember reading a statistic, and now, of course, I never double-checked and fact-checked to make sure it was true, but it sounds true, and I've been repeating it ever since. So, of course, I've been probably spreading lies unknowingly. But I do remember reading that wolves originally, before Columbus came to the United States, or to the Americas, that they occupied 49 of the 50 states. In other words, they were everywhere except for Florida in North America. And now, of course, they're only in just, I think, 2 states, maybe. I guess 3 states, Alaska, Colorado, and Wyoming. Maybe there's another 1 or 2, you could tell me. But does that statistic, maybe you don't know it, does that sound about right, that basically the wolf was everywhere?
It sounds that it could be accurate. It's certainly, they are very adaptable species that can change the sort of habitat they live in and the sort of prey that they hunt, from field mice to bison and buffalo and everything in between. So I would imagine that they roamed the entire continent and down into, I think there is a Mexican gray wolf. Some species have come up. So highly adaptable, but challenging to live with when they return. And they're returning to landscapes in Europe that are more densely populated with people and their livestock than they would have been when they left. So, for example, in Ireland, we had wolves at the end of the 18th century, about 1786. England, Scotland, a bit earlier, 1600s, 1500s. In ecological terms, in geological time, that's the blink of an eye. But in human terms, the world has changed. We have changed.
We change, and we don't remember how things were 100 years ago, and let alone 500 years ago. And we think that whatever world we were born in is the normal. That's the status quo. And that's just a arbitrary point in time. Things were quite different centuries ago. Now, I don't want the wolf to hijack our conversation like they hijack everywhere else. Let's go back to the lynx and talk paradox of the lynx. Because on the one hand, one of the ways to make conservation easy, or at least more palatable for more people, is to make an economic driver to it. And one simple way is, of course, tourism. And people will pay a lot of money to go see elephants in Africa and to go see grizzlies in Alaska. But you can spend $100,000 and you may never see a lynx, even though you can look for a month to see a stupid lynx. How many lynx did you see in all your research?
0.
Exactly. See that point.
I saw 1 wolf. I saw 4 bears. I saw 0 lynx.
Right.
And
The man who writes a book about the lynx, who's got a lynx on the cover, hasn't actually seen a lynx in the wild. I mean, how sad is that? So it's not the paradox. So the point is that how do you use conservation and the motivation of capturing a lynx when the only chance you're ever going to see a lynx is to watch a documentary on National Geographic?
this is the paradox of conservation tourism or coexistence tourism with elusive and cryptic cat species. And if you think that tale is a sad tale, let me make it even sadder by taking you to Nepal, where I did all my PhD research on coexistence, and I continue to support the work of Nepali colleagues there and the work of the Snow Leopard Conservancy on coexistence. And now, to be fair, I am a social scientist. I was talking to people. I'm not a natural scientist who was out trapping snow leopards to put colors on them or even camera trapping. That's the sort of thing that my Nepali colleagues do. But in all the time that I've been there and been back making a short film, doing additional research, I have seen 0 snow leopards. So I have accepted in my life that I spend my whole life, and I may spend my entire life, never seeing the species that I write about or study. Nevertheless, that shows to me the powerful and profound effect these animals have on us, this hold they have in our imagination, because, Francis, they don't just wander the landscapes of the world around us, they wander the landscapes of the world within us. And in our inner landscapes, they take on this larger-than-life persona, this cultural narrative, this symbolism, and that drives, as you've said, that drives the tourism. It is on many people's bucket list to see a snow leopard in the wild, or potentially to see a lynx. But the challenge then is one, seeing them. And we and my colleagues did some research on this and consultation in Nepal with tourists and then with locals. And there is a little bit of snow leopard tourism now in Nepal that we feature in the film and also in some other places, but it's very small in number, and you're never guaranteed a sighting in the way that you might on an African safari. You're likely to see lion if you go to the Serengeti or the Masai Mara or something. That's part of the romanticism of these species. The snow leopard is known as the ghost of the mountains, and the lynx is known as the ghost of the forest. And as that ghostly essence that haunts our imagination that makes them so attractive, I suppose. But it also means with tourism, you're selling the idea of the lynx or the snow leopard as part of a brand of the destination, with the caveat that you'll probably never see one. You can maybe go and check camera traps with scientists, so that's something that you could do. You can be in that landscape and know that they're there. But it's something that's come up in my interviews. When I was writing this book, I was also talking to farming leaders and rewilding leaders in Britain and Ireland about this issue. And one of the farmers that I was talking to just couldn't get his head around this issue. And he said, I was making the case for tourism. I said, you could get money from tourism on your land. You could charge fees to tourism operators. And he said, but how can you have tourism if you never see the species? So it is a paradox. And yet I do think that it has the potential to turn these species from liabilities that eat people's livestock into assets that add value, with, again, that the key issue is to make sure that the income from tourism transfers across to those who are losing livestock to these same animals. There needs to be mechanisms that balance the scales of coexistence.
Which brings me to my final question, Dr. Jonny Hanson. Let me know, if you were dictator of the world and whatever you say, whatever Dr. Hanson says is the law of the land, whether it be in Europe or the United States or Canada or anywhere else, what would you do with regard to the reintroduction of, let's just focus on lynx? What would be your recommendation or your law? Now you have to take off your kind of normal hat. You're kind of a reporter who's trying to always show both sides of the case, but now I'm putting you in charge of being the leader of this whole thing, and you have to decide what's the right policy to have that takes into account the farmers' needs and other people in rural communities that are afraid of have their issues, and balance our desire to preserve this megafauna and apex predators.
I would firstly take a long-term view of this issue and avoid any knee-jerk short-term responses whereby people want lynx or wolves reintroduced because it's cool, which it is, or because they want to see it happen before the end of their career, because charismatic species like this often attract charismatic people. to the cause, and that can be a good thing. They bring passion, but they also sometimes bring ego, and that can be a bit of a challenge. I would take a long-term view and think like, as Aldo Leopold said, think like a mountain. Think over decades about the return of these species. I would use that time to consult and to plan and to make sure that a lot of that consultation and planning and research is done by people who are independent and in the middle, not with skin in the game in terms of wanting these species back. And I would also make sure that then, because in that process you can never please everybody and you can never make sure that everyone is happy, but I would try to make sure that those most affected are most consulted, and also that we're talking about sheep farmers, especially in Britain and Ireland. I would make sure that the money was there over the long term to make them an offer that they cannot refuse. I would think of this in terms of like a business value proposition. A great business succeeds because its products or services make people's lives easier, solve problems for them. So I would make the reintroduction of Lynx something that makes landowners and livestock owners' lives easier, solves a problem for them, adds value to their business, and has the long-term security of the funding of all of that to make sure that people know when they hand their farm over to their children and then onto their grandchildren, that presence of that species in that landscape will not be a risk or a threat to their livelihood, their land, and their way of life, but actually will enhance the place that they call home. That's how I would do it, Francis.
Well said. Where can people get your book? Where would you send them to learn more about you and your documentary that you filmed?
You can go to my website, jonnyhanson.com. You can see the trailer for the short film, find out a little bit more about the book, including the TED Talk, which is like a 10-minute trailer of the book. You can sign up to my quarterly newsletter, and the book is available on Amazon. It's available from the publisher's website, which you can get through the book page on my website and other online book places, both in hardback, in digital, and in audio versions.
Great. I will put links to all that in the show notes. I really appreciate it. I'll end with one little quick anecdote. When I was backpacking in Yosemite National Park in the United States, I did see from the long distance, it was, I believe, a mountain lion or maybe a cougar, potentially. But boy, so small, so far away with my naked eye. Now, that's about as close as I ever got to kind of like a big cat in the wild. And it was just so fleeting. It was only for about 5 seconds I saw it, and then he or she looked at me and then kind of turned around and walked away. It was fascinating. It was fun.
So my turn to ask the questions in this podcast instead of the other way around. How did that make you feel, seeing that?
Well, I was just in awe, impressed by it. I mean, I also saw what I believe was a grizzly. I've seen like 5 bears, but I saw it when I was near the Canadian border in the United States. Also, it came quite close. Like when I say close, maybe about 10 to 20, maybe 20 meters away from or about 60 feet or so, 70 feet max. From what I seen might have been a grizzly, but it could have just been a big brown bear. Regardless, it does make you feel in awe. Makes you feel very vulnerable and weak too. Of course, these are tough predators. They can take you down if they needed it or they wanted it. But you try to remain calm.
Yeah, it is, and that is a great place to finish, because this coexisting with these animals is not just something that we know, it's something that we have to feel as well. And those things that we feel, that range of emotions, are everything from a certain amount of healthy respect and maybe even a bit of fear right through to the awe and wonder. And that's the paradox of coexisting with carnivores in a nutshell right there.
Well said. All right. Well, I encourage everybody to check out your book, especially if they want to hear a very nuanced, refreshing discussion about the whole idea of rewilding apex predators into our modern world today. And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.